is Dr. Maartje Stols-Witlooks from the University of Amsterdam, where she's an associate professor, paintings, conservation, and program director of the MA and APP program in conservation and restoration of cultural heritage. You might have noticed that there is something wrong with the abstracts in the booklet. That is, in the printed booklet. On the online version, things are fine, but the titles with Sarah de Rijcke's presentation and Maartje Stols' presentation have been reversed. So even though Sarah de Rijcke loves Rembrandt, we're not going to present on Rembrandt and the other way around. So we have known each other for quite a few years now, and Maartje has been a key figure in us getting in touch with the people at the Maurits House, as we were looking for some kind of study in art history that would lend itself well to replication. And you've been crucial here and have made this possible. So thanks again so much for that. Also, a fun fact that not many of you might know is that you are, I think a regent is the right term. I looked it up. Regent or regent in the board of an historical courtyard in Amersfoort, where you live. It has existed since 1477, and it supervises 47 houses or housing for elderly people in the city center. And it's called, if you're ever there, Hofje Armen de Bos. That's right. So you're a regent of that. Wonderful. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Rick, and thank you also for giving me the chance to speak here. I'm really enjoying myself today. I'm learning a lot and getting all new kinds of new ideas. And I noticed that some of the ideas that have passed around also link very closely to what I prepared. So we'll see how things connect. I titled my presentation Replicating Practices Redoing Rembrandt, but for those of you expecting a talk on Rembrandt, I have to disappoint you. I thought it would be good to connect to the study that we've just heard so much about, but what I wanted to talk about more is sort of more in general about replicating, redoing, reconstruction, etc. plays a role in my field of study, and how from that starting point how I develop my thoughts on the role of replication in research within the humanities. As I am in the session on replication in the humanities, but let's begin. I think I need this thing. Arrow forward. So what I would like to do is when this thing works. There we go. Just give a brief introduction and then talk a little bit about replication in technical art history, which I always abbreviate as TAH, and conservation studies, which is where I come from. There will be a very brief case on strictly imprimatures to show you a little bit about how I go about redoing things, and then future outlook. But I didn't want to start before saying a little bit about where I am situated as a researcher. And this also connects very well to the talks we just heard, because already in the talks by Charlotte and by Jörn, you learned something about how the kind of environment that people in conservation and restoration do their research in. I placed us here in the middle of a triangle, where you see us between social sciences, conservation science, and technical, between brackets, art history. The field that I'm involved in is sort of, between all those disciplines. Therefore, I don't really consider myself as a humanities scholar, so that also made me a bit humble when I saw that I was in the reflecting on replication in the humanities section, because I think I'm not, I mean, I have one leg in humanities, but I have legs in other fields as well. And working in these fields, it also means that we navigate very different kinds of research environments. You saw already in the talk of Jörn and Charlotte, where sort of more scientific the evidence played a role, that we deal with information that I would describe as factual, experimental, maybe talking about scientific experiments. And there the tradition is really to talk about what you're doing in a depersonified way. So the researcher is not really very present in the way that research is being talked about. And this is a bit different, of course, when you deal with conservation decisions where you have to take into account the values and the meanings that are contained in works of art, and what those meanings are right now for people who look at art, who appreciate art, or get angry about art sometimes. There, the personal and the societal plays a much, a more important role, and that also means that methodologies and the way of speaking about research, takes on elements of that field. And then understanding historical objects of art, how they were made, what layers they have, etc. That is something where we also connect very closely to art history, technical art history, when it comes to artist techniques. And there the focus is to get a historical understanding of sort of more an understanding of a historical image or a text, actually. I should turn it around. And that means that also there the sort of the more hermeneutic ways of doing research become relevant. And so that's the context in which replication sits also in my experience. And I put replication with the question mark because we do a lot of things that have some kind of re in it, but where people might say, well, is that really replication? When you do a conservation treatment, you try to replicate the visual qualities of a painting. This is an example where with the brush, we are filling in little losses so that the image becomes whole again, and people don't focus their eyes on the damage anymore, but can appreciate the color of the 17th century portrait like you see in this detail. And then when it comes to understanding material degradation, there's a completely different way of redoing. We try to mimic, replicate historical, the chemical and the physical properties of historical paints. But as you see, this is an example of a test that I did where we had to look at chemical degradation of a specific blue paint. But there you want to have something that's intercomparable. So you try to get away the hand of the artist. So there the depersonified becomes evident. We instead of painting something on with a brush, we use a paint applicator that allows us to make a paint layer of no thickness that doesn't have the individual brush strokes or sort of my handwriting, so that I can make more scientific comparisons. Then the third category I have called historical practices. If you want to understand a painting or an object of art by replicating the historical genesis of a painting, so redoing all those layers, then the hand becomes important, and there is again a different kind of remaking happening. And then, well, we saw this one. Replication also plays a role in more sort of traditional art historical questions. Think about authentication, art theory, or investigations into the social context of making, where sometimes the kind of replication is just asking the same question as we heard before. So all these kinds of redoing, whatever you call it, have replicative qualities. If you are doing a conservation treatment, you mimic the artist, you try to replicate the artist with the goal of improving the legibility of a work of art, or the sort of that people can appreciate it more. When you're doing research into material degradation, you try to replicate the material composition, but you don't care about, you know, the beauty of a work of art. And there you want to understand chemistry or physics. The replicative quality in investigating historical practices. You might be asking the same question as the original researcher. I'll go into this in a minute. What you do is you try to retrace the steps that an artist took using materials that resemble the ones that they had at their disposal. And there the goal might be to understand a making process, or help you understand what you're actually looking at when you're looking at an object nowadays. And then the fourth category with about replicative, about authentication. The replicative quality may lie in asking the same question, sometimes applying the same methods. And there are goals like establishing authorship or developing an understanding of how an artist functions in society, or how sort of why a work of art came into being. So I think there's quite a big difference between this kind of replication, of course, and the kind that stands central today, because here we're talking about replication more as a way to substantiate earlier conclusions from research. And in my replications, I think the artist stands central. So here we have Rembrandt again standing in his studio, and so that's one of the important reasons why I placed a question mark here, because I think that the kind of replication that I am used to has many differences, but I also see that there are some similarities when I think about sort of the three types of replication that or reproduction that you've seen this graph before. So if I just simply score them, I think for the three categories that you see here, I left the one of the replication of the authentication question out, because we've already done so much talking about that. That's why you see only three here. So conservation treatment, what we replicate is the methods, not necessarily the materials. When it's about material degradation, we might be asking the same question as in the original study. Methods, might be different. The primary sources that we use for information might be the same as the ones that were originally available. And then when you look at historical practices, there is sometimes the question, you try to use materials that tell you something about the past. So there you also try to sort of replicate the materials if you can. And for that you use certain primary sources. What I mean with it, I will give one example for this type of research, so just to give you a bit of an idea. And there was one study that I carried out quite a long time ago. It was published in 2008. But for me, that comes sort of closest to the kind of replication that stands central here. And it has to do with this little painting in the collection. Well, it's not that little, actually. It's quite large for a panel. So it's a sketch by Rubens in the collection of the Mauritshuis. And one of the characteristics of the sketches of Rubens was that when he made them on panel, he often applied like a very sort of brushed layer below the painting, below the figures. And this is called an imprimatura layer. So it's present all over the painting, and it has the brushstrokes very clearly visible. And this gives a very specific visual effect, which you see very well in this detail. The color is a bit different of this photo. This is one I took myself, the others from the website. So what you see here is that, yeah, there we have it, this cursor. So you see here the strictly imprimatura, and then you see that Rubens on top with very loose brushstrokes, painted the horse. And it gives a very specific quality to the painting, something that was very much liked at the time. When you look at historical sources, people were admiring the virtuosity of these kinds of paintings. And well, it's still liked a lot. I think paintings like these, you see them in many museums, and they were, people really like collecting them. So, of course, with such a thin layer and people interested in finding out what Rubens did, the question, what binding medium did Rubens use for these kinds of strictly imprimaturas was asked quite a long time ago already. And by binding medium, I mean the sort of the oil or whatever it is that is mixed with the pigments in order to make it into something that you can spread on top of the ground layer. So there are a lot of analysis of this particular layer, and this gives you an overview of the ones that we had available at the time. So you see in the left, you see the mediums that people thought were used by Rubens for this. So one person says drying oil, so it's some kind of linseed oil. In another instance, glue was found Another one talks about linseed oil, but with the resin. Somebody else gets even more exotic, talks about an emulsion of a drying oil with the protein, so something like egg maybe. And then in another research, they talk about egg, maybe egg and oil emulsion. And then another, with another painting, they found a water-based medium. So the question, what binding medium did Rubens use, knows many answers. And one of the reasons why it knows so many answers is because it's a really thin layer that typically sits between a layer that has glue as a binding medium, is covered by oil, and often those paintings also have varnish. So you can imagine that with time, everything becomes mixed up. So all these things could be true because all those things are present in a painting, and this is such a thin layer that's sampling and really analyzing it with much certainty is very difficult. So with some researchers, I decided to ask this question again. There's the replicative quality. So what binding medium did Rubens use? But we took a different approach. What we did was we started trying out what works. Of all those materials, we just started, making them and then trying them out and see if we get something with similar visual qualities and that resembles the original. And these are just some images from that experiment. So you see me brushing out the imprimatura layer on top of the panels. You see on the bottom left, you see that we are boiling our own glue from materials that resemble the ones that were used historically, according to historical recipes. So that's why you see the detail of a recipe there. When we finished our panels, they look like what you see on top. So no lovely horse. We just made we made the imprimaturas, and we did systematic build-up so that we could then take cross sections, which you see in the middle here. So that's a tiny sample of paint that we put in a block of transparent resin, and then we made we sort of cut it off so that you see the side, like when you cut a cake and you see all the layers. So here you see all the layers, and then at the bottom you have the original painting again. And so asking that same question with a different methodology, we were able to find which ones were not successful, in that they didn't resemble the original, or that we ended up with something that you couldn't even brush out, or that was very crumbly. So we used our own observations for this. We also found out that some materials are successful, that we can create something that really resembles what Rubens did. And so we approached that question with a different method. We basically just examined what works. And in doing this, so this is, I guess, from my past, the thing that comes closest to a replication study. So what we basically did was, we worked from the original painting, used information from earlier analyses. Based on that, we made our own, we did our own replication, and then we tried to tie the conclusions again to what we knew about the original. So what I really like about this kind of study is that it transforms a static object on the museum wall into a process. You learn about how things change, and so it adds a layer to my knowledge of history. And it also gives me information about things that are not clear by just looking at a painting or by just reading. Doing things really adds a layer to my knowledge. And of course, we all know about tested dimensions and things like that. So I'm sure you understand this. And of course, this has some aspects that I can relate to the kind of project that I'm also involved in here, but it is quite different. For me, I describe these kinds of things more as redoing and not necessarily as replication. Because that's also because I'm more interested in the process in a way than in the result, actually. So that was my insight coming up with them. So moving on. I realized that we've opened an older version of my presentation, Daniel, than the one that is on the memory stick. But I think I'll just continue with this one and see. Hope it works. But
this stick though is another one.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
okay.
doesn't matter. So replicating strictly imprimaturus, what have I been doing? Is it conceptual? Is it direct? You know, how can I connect it to what we've been talking about? If you look at the question we asked, the one of the original researchers, what binding medium did Rubens use? I think this kind of work links most directly to conceptual replication, because the method that we used was different. But then when we are replicating artistic procedures based on using materials that were also available to the artist at a certain point, which we know because of knowledge about the painting, etc. There's also something that's I for myself relate to a direct replication, because the methods that I use in executing this research are the same methods, or at least very comparable to those that the artist had available. So it sort of makes me think a bit about the categories that we have here. And I'm pretty sure that what I did was not a reproduction, because my primary sources are, of course, very different than the ones that of Rubens or of Rembrandt that we had here. So this kind of approach, I just wanted to tell you where it comes from. I was trained in this line of thinking by this lady, Leslie Carlisle. She introduced a concept in my field of what we call historically accurate reconstructions, accurate between quotation marks, because accuracy is quite a contested concept in this context. And Leslie herself, she always talks about accuracy, linking it to ISO, the regulation, I don't know, the standards, I don't know what, and ISO thingies, because I'm not so at home in this kind of this. So this is a definition in science and engineering of accuracy, where accuracy, well, this is the table that I find on Wikipedia when I look for this ISO 575.1. So and this is the one that Leslie really liked. So what she says is accuracy. Well, of course you have, yeah, it's a slope. You can become more accurate or less accurate. And she applied that to her research, and so I was taught in this school of thinking, and she actually made a comparison to a bullseye, and I really had to smile when I saw Charlotte's presentation, because you see the similarities, that you also had three circles, but Leslie placed trueness in the middle, and the kind of reconstructions that we make. She says, well, we try to get as close as possible to what the artist originally did, which is the trueness in the middle. And we can do that in several ways. Instead of working with modern artist materials, we can either go a step further and look at a artist manual, and here's one, Giannini is just an example, or we can collect we can make a whole data set of all kinds of historical recipes, see what are the materials most mentioned, and then based on that choose our own materials in reconstructions, and that makes us, gets us closer to the bullseye. Or when you do the same with the binders you use, instead of using modern oil, you can go for one that is you do research into historical cultivars for linseed, and then you get one that is more closer to that. And you can also, in your choice of pigments, of course, instead of from industrial scale, go to reconstructed pigments that you make yourself. And all these things bring you closer to the original, the original artist, and therefore your replication becomes more accurate. And although I understand that line of thinking, I also have actually quite huge problems with it, because the term trueness, I don't think that it's so elusive when you're thinking about historical practice, that I don't think you can actually go straight for trueness, because it's fuzzy. What is true in this case is something that is quite elusive. And that has to do with not knowing what happened. I can never stand in Rembrandt's shoes, but it also has to do with the position of the researcher, and that is what I think I would like to focus the last part of my talk on, because I think that although the position of the researcher has come up in a number of talks, and I recognize some of the things that also steer my thinking about this, I think that it might be worthwhile to give it, to place the researcher a bit more central in our discussions. I want to take as a starting point the 6 categories of reproducibility that Leonelli introduced. I don't know, most people will probably know these, but I'll just go through them very quickly. So computational reproducibility, the kind of reproducibility that's possible when, for instance, in the computational world, where you have a data set, you have an algorithm, and you rerun data in order to, you just reproduce that kind of protocol. It's fairly yes, no, I think. It's not my field, but I think it's sort of the most clear category. Then there is direct experimental reproducibility, where you can work with standardized experiments in a standardized environment. The third category she defines as scoping, indirect and hypothetical reproducibility, working with semi-standardized experiments. And then we have reproducible expertise, non-standard experiments and research on rare materials, reproducible observation, non-experimental case description, and irreproducible research, participant observation. And I think the kind of replications that I encounter in my field fall mainly within the last 3 categories. And these are all categories that involve environments or inputs that are difficult to standardize or repeat. And they share with each other that, in my mind at least, there is a clearly distinctive role for the researcher, their influence on the research process, and reflection on the person of the researcher, so the us here in the room as well, I think is very important. And I think we need to think a bit more about our lens, our perspective on the kind of studies that we do in comparison to that of the original researcher. Because when I put myself and Rembrandt or whoever, a young artist, on the same page, I wonder, I mean, if I ask the same research question, do I in fact ask the same research question? Because my perspective is so different. And even if I try to do a complete reproduction, I do this because I want to do a reproduction. So my whole vision on the process and on the project differs. So even if I ask the same question, can I actually do that? And the same goes for research methods. Even if I try to mimic them as much as possible, the fact that I try to mimic them steers how I conduct my research. The original researcher in Jörn was exploring, and he was doing his own research, and based on what he found with one method, he would choose the next. But if I try to retrace your steps, then I retrace your steps. So I don't retrace the thinking process. So that I really think that this is quite important, and that I want to think about it more, and I hope you want to think with me about this more. And and I try to put my thoughts on paper, and then I always like to sort of organize things in table form, but this is something it's really sort of emerging thoughts, and it's not at all finished, and I'm sure there's a lot to say about this, but I'll try anyway. I think that in order to move forward, when we think about replication, I think we need to broaden our view a little. Replicating a protocol or data is something that can be done by different people with different goals. And I would like to make a distinction, first of all, between the researcher who continues along the same lines of research and uses the same methods and the same protocol, progressing in research. Like I think the example that Jörn was showing us is already one where you ask the question, you ask it again, and every time you're replicating your own research in a way, and that gives a very distinctive perspective. And it's also something that characterizes the Rembrandt Research Project. And then you have the other researcher who may be using the same protocol, working with the same data. And in both cases, I think the goal can be to aim for a larger robustness of the conclusions, or of the reasoning in the case of the other researcher, I think, because there, by redoing, you can also retrace the steps of thinking of the other researcher. You see a third column. It's not really, it's not the same category, but I think it's also a perspective that gives another maybe aim for replication, and that is the kind of replication that I do most. That is trying to find out more about history. So using replication not as a method to find out if earlier people were right, or maybe you know, I come to different conclusions, but to use it as an ethnographic or a historical research method. There I want to understand the reasoning and the practices of somebody in history, and I'm not necessarily that interested, I might be, but not necessarily in whether their conclusions were right, because I want to find out about their world, and I don't need to draw it into my world in that sense. And in each of these categories, I think when we look a bit broader, I mean, some of the things in here have already been mentioned by others, but if the same person replicates their own research, they also gain further insights from the same data. And it also helps them reflect on their own position and on their own research practices. So redoing your own work also brings you forward. And redoing something with the aim of you know, creating more clarity about your research process by maybe thinking, okay, I want to do this in such a way that somebody else will be able to replicate it in future. That also improves your quality of reporting, allowing for you know, allowing for a greater level of scrutiny, if you can call it that. And then thinking about the other researcher, well, a lot of the same things apply. Of course, when another researcher uses the same data, they can not only go backward to the original research, but it can also lead to further insights and help them forward. So it doesn't have to be only looking back. And yeah, the tacit and local dimensions of the original research, of course, are interesting to know about, and the relevant variants that have been mentioned in some of the literature that I read for today are also things that you learn from this. And but I also think that redoing, yeah, or using somebody else's protocol or working with the same data is a way that can stand at the basis of extending or adapting or broadening your own research, and therefore it can also inspire you towards the future. So I think looking broadly at what replication can do in humanities, I think we can be a bit more, you know, forward-looking in a way maybe. And then as a historical, to understand historical research method or historical practice, is also something I think that's well, that I put that in my list for using it as a research method. There, of course, also test local dimensions and using the original as an inspiration to direct it at the future is I think an option. And so if you look at that, then I think yeah, the same. Yeah, in each of these categories, I think in both of the ones on the left, I'll call them, yeah, it has effect both on the original research, and it can sort of help research forward. And I think with yeah, the original process, of course, stands central when you want to know about history. So I think there's also a difference in the kinds of goals that you can reach with these. So. Nearly there. So to summarize, I think that I'm very interested in reflecting on the role of the researchers, because it's both the original and the future researcher, and also on the purpose of replication, because I think it would be a pity if we only use it for validation, but also that we can find uses for it as a research method that is sort of, you know, that is not about agreeing or not agreeing with the original conclusions. And in that sense, I think it's also, it's a method. And I think it's important to also see how replication studies can be integrated into a broader range of methodologies to support or improve research quality. And I know many of these have been mentioned already in the literature. I think in Sarah's article were inspiration for me. But yeah, so that's, I think that's where I should stop. So those are some rough thoughts at the end. I hope they make some sense. I did a bit of reading to prepare for this talk, and I didn't refer to everything directly, but just to know what I've been reading about.
Thank you,